You wake up one more morning with that familiar tightness in your chest. Another notification about someone else's achievement. Another mental checklist of everything you still need to acquire, accomplish, become. You tell yourself that once you get that promotion, once you reach that income level, once you finally have enough, then you will feel satisfied. Then you will feel complete. Then you will finally breathe. But here is what keeps you awake at 3 in the morning. The truth you cannot quite name. You have been climbing this ladder for years, checking boxes, accumulating victories. And that feeling of arrival never comes. The goalpost keeps moving. The emptiness keeps expanding. You are exhausted from chasing, but terrified of stopping because what if stopping means you are giving up? What if pausing means you are falling behind in a race everyone else seems to be winning? Your relationships feel transactional. Your accomplishments feel hollow 5 minutes after you achieve them. You look at your life on paper and it looks impressive, but you look at your life from the inside, and it feels like you are performing a role that was written for someone else. You feel like a fraud in your own existence, going through motions that society applauded, but your soul never voted for. Here is what makes this so devastating. You did everything right. You followed the blueprint. You worked hard, sacrificed relationships, delayed gratification, and pushed through every obstacle they told you to push through. And now you are standing at the top of a mountain you are not even sure you wanted to climb, looking around at a view that was supposed to fulfill you, and all you feel is an aching question. Is this really it? The worst part is not the emptiness itself. The worst part is that you cannot even admit it out loud because everyone thinks you have it all together. Everyone thinks you are winning. So you smile at the dinner table while your mind screams about meaning and purpose and the terrifying possibility that you have spent years of your life optimizing for the wrong variables. You keep adding more to your plate because stopping feels like dying. You equate rest with failure. You confuse stillness with stagnation. And beneath all of it, underneath every new goal and every new acquisition, is a simple, devastating truth you have been running from. You are not actually chasing success. You are running from the fear that without the chase, without the constant motion, without the next achievement on the horizon, you might have to face who you actually are and discover that you do not know anymore. The most revolutionary discovery Abraham Maslow ever made was not about what drives human beings to succeed. It was about what happens when they finally stop mistaking accumulation for actualization, and why the people who changed the world were not the ones chasing more, but the ones who stopped chasing altogether and started living from a completely different operating system. Today, I'm going to show you why everything you were taught about achievement and fulfillment has been backwards, why true self-actualization does not begin when you finally have enough, but the exact moment you stop believing that more will ever be enough, and how Maslow discovered that the most fulfilled people on earth were not the ones who conquered the most, but the ones who fundamentally changed what they were trying to conquer in the first place. In 1943, Abraham Maslow was studying something that fascinated him more than pathology or dysfunction. While his colleagues focused on what was broken in human psychology, Maslow became obsessed with what was whole. He wanted to understand the small percentage of people who seemed to have cracked some invisible code about existence, individuals who were not just successful, but genuinely fulfilled, not just accomplished, but deeply at peace. He started studying figures like Eleanor Roosevelt, Albert Einstein, Abraham Lincoln, and lesser-known individuals who exhibited what he called psychological health. But here is what stopped him cold. These were not people who had achieved everything they wanted. Many of them faced immense struggles, financial hardship, social rejection, and profound loss. What they had in common was not external abundance. It was a fundamental shift in what they were seeking. Maslow spent months interviewing subjects, reading biographies, analyzing patterns, and what he discovered contradicted every assumption about human motivation that dominated psychology at the time. The people who were most fulfilled, most creative, most at peace with themselves were not the ones still climbing. They were the ones who had stopped trying to prove something. They had stopped performing for an invisible audience. They had stopped seeking validation through accumulation. And in that stopping, in that radical release of the chase, they had found what everyone else was still searching for. One of Maslow's subjects was a woman in her 50s who had spent her entire adult life building a successful career in education. She had climbed the ranks, earned respect, published papers, and accumulated every marker of professional success. By every conventional measure, she had made it. But she described her 40s as a decade of profound internal crisis. She would sit in board meetings where important decisions were being made and feel completely disconnected from her own life. She had everything she said she wanted, but waking up felt like putting on a costume. The turning point came not during a moment of triumph, but during a moment of complete stillness. She was sitting in her garden on a Sunday morning, no agenda, no goals, nothing to accomplish, and for the first time in decades she was not mentally rehearsing the next week or reviewing the past one. She was just there. And in that space of not chasing, not optimizing, not improving, something shifted. She realized she had been operating her entire life from a question she never consciously chose. How do I become more impressive? Her whole framework for living had been constructed around external validation, around climbing a hierarchy of prestige that she adopted from her environment without ever asking if it was actually hers. In that garden, she asked herself a different question. What do I actually value when no one is watching and no one is grading? The answer that emerged was not what she expected. It was not a bigger title or a better salary. It was presence. It was depth. It was contributing to the growth of young minds not because it looked good on her resume, but because it genuinely moved her. She described the months that followed as the most disorienting and liberating of her life. She stopped saying yes to opportunities that boosted her status but drained her energy. She started saying no to prestigious committees that felt performative. She restructured her work around direct contact with students, which paid less and impressed fewer people, but made her feel alive in a way she had forgotten was possible. Maslow documented this pattern again and again. The shift from chasing to being, the transition from proving to expressing, the radical reorientation from external validation to internal alignment. But he also documented something else. He documented how difficult this shift was, how disorienting, how terrifying. Because when you stop chasing, when you step off the treadmill of more, you have to face something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You have to face the possibility that everything you were chasing was a distraction from the real work. The work of becoming who you actually are beneath all the conditioning, all the performances, all the borrowed dreams you have been living out on autopilot. Maslow called this level of human experience self-actualization, but he was very clear that self-actualization was not another achievement to collect. It was not the top rung of a ladder you climb by accumulating enough success. It was a fundamentally different way of being that only becomes possible when you stop climbing altogether, when you stop trying to become someone impressive and start trying to become someone real. Here is what Maslow realized that changed everything. Most people never reach self-actualization, not because they fail to achieve enough, but because they succeed at achieving too much of the wrong things. They spend decades optimizing for variables that society handed them. They climb hierarchies of prestige, wealth, status, and approval, without ever pausing to ask if these hierarchies align with their actual values. They mistake the relief of external validation for the satisfaction of internal alignment. And the more they succeed at this game, the harder it becomes to stop playing because their entire identity becomes wrapped up in the performance. Their relationships reward the performance. Their income depends on the performance. Their sense of self is built on the performance. So even when they feel the emptiness, even when they wake up at 3 a.m. with that existential dread, they double down on the chase because stopping feels like annihilation. But here is the paradox Maslow discovered. True self-actualization, genuine fulfillment, deep psychological health, these states do not emerge from having more. They emerge from needing less. Not materially, but psychologically. They emerge when you stop outsourcing your sense of worth to achievements and start anchoring it in something that cannot be taken away by market shifts or public opinion or the passage of time. They emerge when you fundamentally change the question you are asking. Not how do I become more successful, but how do I become more myself? Maslow identified several levels of human needs that operate in a rough hierarchy. At the base are physiological needs. the things your body requires to survive, like food, water, and shelter. Once those are handled, you move to safety needs, the need for stability, security, and freedom from threat. After safety comes the need for love and belonging, for connection, for being seen and accepted by others. Then comes the need for esteem, for respect, for accomplishment, for feeling valuable in the eyes of your community. And at the top, fundamentally different from all the others, comes self-actualization, the need to become the fullest expression of who you actually are. But here is what most people misunderstand about this hierarchy. They think you climb it like a ladder, one rung at a time, and once you reach the top, you have won. But Maslow discovered something more complex. He discovered that most people get stuck in the esteem level. They secure their basic needs. They establish safety. They find belonging. And then they spend the rest of their lives endlessly pursuing esteem, accumulating achievements, chasing status, seeking approval, trying to become impressive in the eyes of others. And this pursuit becomes so consuming, so identity-defining, that they never even realize there is another level. They never realize that self-actualization is not about becoming more impressive. It is about becoming more honest. It is about shedding the performances and the masks and the borrowed dreams and discovering what remains. One of the patterns Maslow documented was what he called the peak experience, moments of profound clarity, unity, and transcendence that self-actualized people reported with unusual frequency. These were not necessarily mystical or religious experiences, though they could be. They were moments when the noise of the ego quieted and something deeper emerged. A musician losing herself completely in a performance. A scientist experiencing a sudden intuition that cracks open a problem. A parent holding their child and feeling a love so vast it dissolves the boundaries of self. What fascinated Maslow was that these experiences almost never happened during moments of striving or achieving. They happened during moments of surrender, during moments of being so present, so aligned, so free from the need to be anywhere other than exactly where you were, that something beyond your constructed self could emerge. And the people who experience these moments most often were not the ones with the most impressive resumes. They were the ones who had stopped constructing resumes as their primary mode of existing. Maslow studied a man who had been a high-level executive at a major corporation. This man had spent 20 years climbing, competing, accumulating. He had the salary, the title, the respect. He also had a stress-related heart condition, a marriage that felt like a business partnership, and a pervasive sense that he was living in a simulation of his own life. The crisis came during a routine physical, when his doctor told him that if he did not fundamentally change his relationship to work, he might not make it to 60. That night, sitting alone in his home office surrounded by awards and plaques, he asked himself a question that had been trying to surface for years. If I died tomorrow, what would I actually regret? The answer was immediate and devastating. He would not regret the promotions he did not get, or the deals he did not close. He would regret that he had not been present for his daughter's childhood. He would regret that he had treated his marriage like an item on a checklist. He would regret that he had spent decades building an identity that felt impressive from the outside but hollow from the inside. He took a leave of absence. He started therapy. He began meditating, not because it was trendy, but because he desperately needed to learn how to be still without his mind screaming at him about productivity. And slowly, agonizingly, he started making different choices. He turned down a promotion that would have meant more money but less time. He started coaching Little League, something he had never done because it did not advance his career. He began having conversations with his wife that were not about logistics but about what they actually felt and wanted and feared. What Maslow noted in cases like this was that the shift was not comfortable. It was terrifying, because when you step off the treadmill, you have to confront the parts of yourself you have been using achievement to avoid. You have to face your insecurities without the armor of accomplishments. You have to sit with your relationships when they are not transactional. You have to discover who you are when you are not performing. And for many people, that emptiness, that uncertainty, feels unbearable. So they jump back on the treadmill, They find a new goal to chase, a new way to optimize, a new external marker to prove they are enough. But the people who pushed through that discomfort, who sat with the uncertainty, who learned to derive their sense of self from internal alignment rather than external validation, these were the people who reported the deepest satisfaction, the most profound sense of meaning, the most authentic joy, not because their lives became perfect, but because their lives became theirs. Look, here is what I see happening in the comments every single video. People sharing how they have spent years building something that looks successful but feels empty. People recognizing that they have been operating from someone else's definition of winning. People realizing that the exhaustion they feel is not from working too hard, but from working towards something that was never actually theirs to begin with. If that resonates with you, if you are starting to recognize that the chase itself might be the problem, leave a simple comment and just write this: I am ready to stop performing and start living. Your honesty might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today, to give themselves permission to step off their own treadmill. You have more power to create space for authenticity than you realize. This is not just about you. It is about building a community where we can admit that the script we were handed does not fit anymore, and that is okay. That is not failure. That is the beginning of something real. Maslow also documented the obstacles that prevent people from making this shift. He called one of them the Jonah complex, the fear of one's own greatness. The fear that if you actually stepped into your full potential, if you actually became who you are capable of becoming, the demands would be too great, the responsibility too heavy, the visibility too exposing. So people self-sabotage. They stay small. They keep themselves busy with trivial pursuits because as long as they are distracted by the chase for more, they do not have to face the terrifying possibility of what they could actually create, contribute, or become if they stopped hiding behind busyness and started living with intention. Another obstacle he identified was the need for safety and predictability. Self-actualization requires stepping into uncertainty. It requires making choices that might not make sense to the people around you. It requires disappointing some people, setting boundaries, saying no to opportunities that look good on paper but feel wrong in your gut. And for people whose sense of safety is tied to approval, to fitting in, to not rocking the boat, this level of authenticity feels dangerous. So they stay in the esteem level. They keep chasing achievements that earn applause even if those achievements do not align with their deepest values. They optimize for the wrong variables because optimizing for the right ones would require a level of courage they are not sure they possess. Another pattern Maslow identified in self-actualized people was what he called being cognition, a way of perceiving reality that was less filtered by ego, less distorted by need, less contaminated by judgment. Self-actualized people had a capacity to see things as they actually were, not as they needed them to be to confirm their worldview. They could sit with complexity. They could hold paradox. They could appreciate beauty without needing to possess it. They could witness suffering without needing to fix it immediately. They had a kind of detached engagement, deeply involved in their work and relationships, but not desperately attached to outcomes. They cared intensely, but without the neurotic edge of someone whose identity depends on success. This way of being only became possible, Maslow argued, when people stopped trying to use external achievements to fill internal voids. When they stopped treating life like a problem to be solved and started treating it like an experience to be lived. Maslow studied another subject, a social worker who spent years working in underfunded communities. This woman did not have wealth or fame or prestigious credentials, but everyone who encountered her described a quality of presence that was rare. She listened in a way that made people feel truly heard. She worked with intensity but without burnout. She faced heartbreaking situations without becoming cynical or detached. When Maslow interviewed her, he asked what kept her going when the problems she faced were so overwhelming. She said something that became central to his understanding of self-actualization. She said she did not do the work to fix the world or to earn recognition or to prove she was a good person. She did it because it was an expression of who she was. The work was not separate from her. It was not a performance or a duty. It was simply the most honest way she knew how to be in the world. And because her sense of worth was not dependent on outcomes, she could engage fully without being destroyed by failure. She could celebrate small victories without needing them to validate her existence. She had found what Maslow called a calling, not in the religious sense but in the psychological sense. A way of being that was so aligned with her deepest self that it did not feel like sacrifice, it felt like coming home. What Maslow realized was that self-actualization was not an endpoint. It was not something you achieve once and then you are done. It was an ongoing process of shedding, of releasing, of becoming more honest about who you are and what you value. It required constantly interrogating your motivations, constantly asking whether you are acting from your authentic self or from the internalized voice of authority figures, cultural expectations, or childhood wounds. It required developing what he called autonomy, the capacity to be self-directed, to trust your own perceptions, to make choices based on your values even when those choices do not earn applause. And this autonomy, this internal locus of control, was threatening to systems that depend on compliance. It was threatening to relationships built on performance. It was threatening to an identity constructed around being impressive, which is why so few people ever made the leap. Not because they could not, but because the cost of authenticity felt too high when your entire life was built around a different set of values. Maslow also identified a phenomenon he called regression, the tendency to slide back down the hierarchy during times of stress or threat. Even people who had touched self-actualization could regress to lower levels when their safety was threatened or their belonging was at risk. A person who had been living from deep internal alignment might suddenly become consumed with status and approval after a professional failure or a social rejection. A person who had found peace might suddenly become obsessed with accumulation after a financial scare. This was not failure, it was human. But what differentiated self-actualized people was their capacity to recognize the regression, to notice when they were slipping back into old patterns, and to consciously choose to return to their deeper values rather than getting trapped in the reaction. They had developed a kind of psychological flexibility that allowed them to move between levels as needed but always return to their center. Maslow studied someone else, a teacher who had spent decades in the public school system. This teacher had been recognized with awards, praised by administrators, respected by colleagues. But in his 60s, he made a choice that confused everyone around him. He stepped down from a leadership position that came with more pay and less classroom time, and he returned to teaching full-time in one of the most challenging schools in the district. When people asked him why, he struggled to explain it in a way that made sense to the logic of more. He said that the leadership role had felt like managing, and what he actually loved was teaching. He said that the awards and recognition had been nice, but they had become a distraction from the work that actually mattered to him. He said that he had spent too many years optimizing for what looked impressive, and not enough years doing what felt true. So he made a choice that looked like a step backward to everyone else, but felt like a step forward to him. And the last decade of his career, the decade where he had less status and less income and less prestige, was the decade he described as the most meaningful, because he was no longer performing teaching. He was living it. This is the paradox at the heart of self-actualization. To the external world, it often looks like less. It looks like turning down opportunities. It looks like simplifying when you could be expanding. It looks like choosing meaning over money, presence over prestige, alignment over achievement. And in a culture that measures worth by accumulation, these choices look like failure. They look like giving up. They look like settling. But from the inside, from the lived experience of the person making these choices, it feels like finally waking up. It feels like finally living your own life instead of auditioning for someone else's approval. It feels like the difference between existing and being alive. Maslow was very clear that self-actualization did not mean withdrawing from the world or rejecting ambition. Self-actualized people were often highly productive, deeply creative, and significantly impactful. But their productivity came from a different source. It was not driven by a need to prove anything or fill an internal void. It was driven by what Maslow called being motivation. Motivation that arose from fullness rather than lack, from expression rather than compensation, from love of the work itself rather than love of what the work might earn them. The challenge, Maslow found, was that most people could not even conceive of this way of being because they had never experienced it. They had spent so long in the esteem level, so long optimizing for external validation, that they had lost touch with their own internal compass. They did not know what they actually wanted, because they had spent decades wanting what they were supposed to want. They did not know what brought them joy because they had spent decades pursuing what brought them approval. And when you suggest to someone in that state that maybe the answer is not more achievement, but less attachment to achievement, it sounds like you are asking them to give up. It sounds like you are asking them to settle, because they cannot yet distinguish between the drive that comes from insecurity and the drive that comes from inspiration. They have been running on the former for so long that they think it is the only fuel available. Maslow also wrote about the courage required to be disliked, to make choices that do not earn applause, to prioritize your internal sense of rightness over external validation. He noted that self-actualized people had developed a kind of independence from the opinions of others. Not arrogance, not defiance, but a quiet groundedness in their own values that made them less susceptible to manipulation by praise or punishment. They could receive feedback without being destroyed by criticism. They could achieve success without becoming addicted to applause. They had learned to generate their sense of worth from the inside, which made them less controllable, less predictable, and significantly more free. One of the questions Maslow grappled with was whether self-actualization was accessible to everyone or only to a privileged few who had the luxury of basic security. He concluded that while having your basic needs met certainly made the journey easier, self-actualization was not about external circumstances. It was about internal orientation. He documented people who had very little material wealth but who lived with profound authenticity, and people who had immense wealth but who were trapped in performances. The difference was not what they had, it was what they were willing to release. The willingness to let go of the need to be impressive. The willingness to disappoint people whose approval you once craved. The willingness to admit that the life you built might not be the life you actually want. The willingness to start over, to simplify, to choose differently, to stop proving and start being. Another insight Maslow documented was that self-actualized people had a different relationship to time. They were less haunted by the past and less anxious about the future. They had a capacity to be fully present in the moment without constantly evaluating whether this moment was good enough, or productive enough, or impressive enough. They could engage in an activity for its own sake, not as a means to an end. They could have a conversation without an agenda. They could take a walk without turning it into exercise. They could sit in silence without feeling like they were wasting time. This presence, this ability to be where they were, was not something they achieved through discipline or technique. It was a natural byproduct of no longer using the present moment as a vehicle to get to a future moment that would finally make them enough. Maslow spent years compiling research on self-actualization, and toward the end of his life he added another level to his hierarchy. He called it transcendence, a state beyond self-actualization where the focus shifted from personal fulfillment to service, to contributing to something larger than oneself. But even this, he was careful to note, was not about achieving or accumulating. It was about expressing. It was about allowing what was most true and deep within you to move through you into the world. It was not performance. It was participation. Not in the sense of attending, but in the sense of being part of something that was happening through you, not by you. And this level, this state of flow and contribution and meaning, was only accessible to people who had stopped trying to use their life to prove something and started trying to use their life to give something. What Maslow ultimately discovered was that the most fulfilled human beings were not the ones who had accumulated the most or achieved the most or impressed the most people. They were the ones who had stopped measuring their worth by those metrics altogether. They were the ones who had made the terrifying, liberating leap from proving to being, from performing to expressing, from chasing to living. And that leap did not happen when they finally had enough. It happened when they stopped believing that more would ever be enough, when they stopped outsourcing their sense of worth to achievements and accomplishments and accolades, when they stopped treating life like a competition and started treating it like an invitation to show up as who they actually were, to contribute what was uniquely theirs to give, to live with honesty and presence and a kind of radical authenticity that made them unemployable, by the standards of a culture built on performance, but irreplaceable by the standards of a life built on truth. The shift from chasing to being is not about doing less or achieving less. It is about fundamentally changing the why behind what you do. It is about moving from achievement as compensation for unworthiness to achievement as expression of who you are. It is about releasing the exhausting project of becoming someone impressive and embracing the liberating project of becoming someone real. And that shift, that reorientation is available to you right now, not when you finally have enough money or status or success. Right now, in this moment. The moment you stop believing that more will fix what only honesty can heal. The moment you stop performing for an invisible audience and start living for the audience of your own deepest self. The moment you realize that self-actualization is not the prize at the end of the climb. It is what becomes possible the second you stop climbing altogether and start asking a different question. Not how do I become more, but how do I become me? I know how disorienting this can feel. You have spent so long being told that the answer is to push harder, achieve more, never settle, optimize every area of your life. And here I am suggesting that maybe the answer is not addition but subtraction, not accumulation but release, not climbing but landing. If you have made it this far, if something in these words has resonated with the part of you that is exhausted from chasing and ready to start living, then I want to invite you to continue this journey with us. This is not just one video. This is an ongoing exploration of what it means to live authentically in a world that rewards performance. Every week, we go deeper into the insights that Maslow and others discovered about human flourishing, about moving from survival to meaning, from proving to being. If you want to be part of a community that is asking the same questions, struggling with the same tensions, and committed to building lives that feel true instead of just impressive, then join us. Hit that subscribe button not because I told you to, but because you recognize that this conversation is one you need to keep having. Because you are ready to stop performing and start discovering who you have been, underneath all the roles and expectations and borrowed dreams. The next video we are going to explore something that might sound counterintuitive, but is absolutely essential. We are going to talk about why the people who experience the most profound sense of belonging are not the ones trying hardest to fit in, but the ones brave enough to stop pretending. Why authenticity, not performance, is the foundation of real connection, and how Maslow discovered that the loneliest people were often the most socially successful because they had spent so long performing that they had forgotten how to be seen. If you have ever felt alone in a room full of people, if you have ever wondered whether anyone actually knows the real you, then that video is going to hit differently. I will see you there, not as someone who has it all figured out, but as someone walking the same path, asking the same questions, and discovering that the journey from performing to being is the most important work we will ever do. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your honesty. Thank you for having the courage to question whether the life you are building is actually the life you want to live. That question is not a sign of failure. It is the beginning of freedom.